Welcome everyone to the October Hampton Roads chapter of ASPA's webinar on infrastructure and resilience. I'm Wee Youssef. I'm chair for the chapter this year, and welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. I do want to apologize for the late notice on this webinar. I had hoped to have two presenters, but one of them unfortunately notified me last week that he had jury duty this week, and the uncertainty of trying to plan an event around having to call in and figure out jury duty schedules was a little more challenging. That said, I have no doubt that Karen's presentation will be more than enough to inspire us and to help us think more about the role of green infrastructure and resilience. So I do want to let everybody know that this event is being recorded. So if you have concerns, feel free to change your name or make yourself anonymous. And I will post this recording to the ASPA Hampton Roads chapter website. If you have colleagues or friends who are unable to attend the webinar, please feel free to direct them to the recording. My other ask is just to make sure that you mute yourself while Karen is presenting. Karen, do you have a preference for questions during the presentation or after?
I would say after, but if you want to post them to the chat while I'm talking, so you don't have to remember what your question was. And if I have enough brain dexterity, I'll answer them live. But if
so let's,
yeah. So
I understand.
Either way.
But let's try and keep our questions till the end so that we don't disrupt the flow of the presentation. But in case you worry about forgetting your question, please feel free to type them in the chat as well. Karen, all yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me today. As I noted, when I was contacted about doing this presentation, and there was the challenge of not having a second speaker, I was more than able to keep talking all day, but I promise not to talk more than the time I'm supposed to. So today I'm going to be talking about utilizing natural green infrastructure for resilient landscapes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do with the Green Infrastructure Center. I'm going to talk about what is landscape scale green infrastructure. I'm going to talk about how you might use trees in cities and counties as green infrastructure, and then give you a case study for coastal resilience and a plan that we developed for Norfolk, Virginia, and then hopefully have left some time for discussion. So I direct the Green Infrastructure Center, which was actually an idea that came to me out of a class that I taught at the University of Virginia in 2006. And I got so carried away with this notion of green infrastructure that I decided to start a not-for-profit. So the Green Infrastructure Center helps communities evaluate their green assets to maximize their ecological, economic, and cultural returns. So nature has many different benefits for us, and if we fully evaluate them and assess them and quantify them, we can make it more likely that local governments will want to take the effort to protect them. So we do this work by building landscape models. So we do a lot of work with GIS and a lot of different kinds of environmental analysis. We teach courses and workshops such as this one. I conduct research into new methods, and that's why we're a not-for-profit, because we can often propose an idea and then develop the research behind it, and then helping communities create strategies on the ground. So we do a lot of demonstration projects. And as was mentioned just a moment ago before we started the presentation, I also teach at the University of Virginia. And so each year our class adopts a community to do a city or town-wide or county-wide plan. And then in the spring semester, we also do site design. So I just put that out there if any of you are interested in Virginia and having our class adopt you and provide some pro bono work. So I've written a lot of guides and books to help spread the word about this work, and also to provide some of the how-to guidance. This one I'm showing now, Strategic Green Infrastructure, a multi-scale approach, is really designed for planners, county administrators, city managers. It's definitely written more for those who are tasked with implementing this kind of work in the planning realm. I mentioned that because I have other much more technical books, but that one is really good for anybody, even if you don't have a background in this. And I'm going to begin with the origin of the term green infrastructure, because we hear that term a lot, but many people don't understand where those words came from. Like many ideas, it has a beginning. And it actually came from the state of Florida, who coined the term green infrastructure in 1994. The Florida Greenways Commission was working on a report for the governor, and they were trying to think, how can we help the governor understand that Lake Okeechobee, our amazing dune system, the Everglades, the river of grass, the wonderful forests in the Panhandle, all of these natural resources are green infrastructure, just like we take care of our roads or our roads, bridges and roads. We also need to take care of our green infrastructure. So gray infrastructure and green infrastructure together. So that really took hold. The governor understood that notion, and at the time they actually had a fund for land acquisition. So they built the state's and actually the nation's first green infrastructure model, where they modeled the landscape to figure out where those most important assets were located, and then set about acquiring some of them, which became either part of a preserve or a park plan. So probably more of you have heard of green infrastructure as what I call constructed green infrastructure: rain gardens, permeable pavers, fill-terra boxes. And the time frame for when we started calling sort of what was previously natural infrastructure like forests and wetlands, we started calling it rain gardens, permeable pavers, et cetera, happened in 2006, when a political appointee at EPA added what was previously called best management practices to the definition of green infrastructure. So I refer to that as constructed green infrastructure, so that we can be clear when I'm talking about wetlands and forests, and when I'm talking about something you might construct and design, such as permeable pavement. The real key here is to first consider taking care of our natural infrastructure first, our trees, forests, and rivers. Protect them and connect them. Build in the least impactful manner. So for example, maybe you have a building that goes taller instead of wider, and then mitigate the impacts. So first conservation and then mitigation. And we'll get into this in more detail in the presentation. So green infrastructure planning requires thinking about the landscape as a connected network. So it's not just thinking about one park here or one wetland over there, but thinking not only about the attractiveness of those habitats, but how they connect. Because the more connected the landscape is, the more resilient it is. This is the problem that happens even when we have sort of what we might call green or cluster developments, where they protect some green space and then maybe build not on the whole lot, but maybe on half of the property. But we need to think past just our parcel boundaries. So we can keep the land connected, but we have to think at a different scale than traditional parcel scale. So in this example here, perhaps on the left-hand side, that becomes a park or a purchase of development rights or a conservation easement. In the middle, we develop only on half the lot. And in the far right lot, we have more dense development. So you can see that we can have nature and connectivity even in dense cities, but we have to think ahead and build those networks. So one of the, I'm going to show you today some thinking at different scales. So we work at all different scales. We even built a national map for Esri. But here's a map of a landscape that we're working on now in coastal Virginia. We're doing a demonstration project for coastal counties and cities in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. And what we're looking at is not only the intact natural resources of the landscape, but we're also looking at all the things that might impact them, such as fire, pests, invasive pests, storm surges from hurricanes, zoning threats where maybe the zoning isn't adequate, development pressures, et cetera. And so we're looking at what's happening to our forests, and we're actually looking at the cumulative threats, where some areas actually have multiple threats stacked on top of one another. And the question is, what should we do if we don't want to realize a future where we've lost a lot? So we're now working on strategies with the local governments. We have a committee made up of local governments, but then we also have a state committee, because some of the issues that come up at the regional and local scale have implications for state policy. So an example of that might be solar farms, where we're finding in Gloucester County, for example, that large scale utility solar was threatening a lot of the forests, and yet the state wants to promote, a secure carbon, energy future. So carbon sequestration. We want to look at alternative energy sources, but at the same time, should we cut down the forest? Get rid of all that carbon sequestering to build solar farms. So that's a situation where we need better policy at our state level. So there's a number of issues like that that are bubbling up from the local scale. So we have a state committee, and then we have a local committee. And already some of the local governments have implemented some of the recommendations of the project. So now I'm going to just get into urban flooding for a moment here, because that is a major indicator of how resilient you are. And as you know, a lot of our coastal communities are facing new threats. They're seeing more flooding from higher seas, but we're also having inland communities also suffering because we're getting more extreme weather events. So let's just take a pause for a moment and talk about flooding. It's natural, right? I mean, flooding's always occurred. It's a normal event. And, we are used to having higher tides during full moon cycles. And of course, floods have an important environmental benefit. They restore rich soils to floodplains, and alluvial fans of coastal plains replenish land that has been lost to erosion. However, we've changed our hydrology by channelizing rivers, trapping them in channels, creating greater downstream velocities instead of allowing floodwaters to spread out and slowly dissipate. So flooding becomes a problem because we have built historically along rivers and lakes. So many historic cities and towns, of course, were built that way. But what's happening is, as weather systems are becoming more erratic, we're starting to see cities suffering a lot more. And so is it happening more often? Yes. Well, one of the things that's happening is we are continuing to develop. So even some of our older cities are continuing to grow out and somewhat sprawl. And so we're having more impervious surface and more runoff. And especially in older cities where they were built before the Clean Water Act requirements for stormwater control, you have a lot of older cities, especially in the South, where maybe 80% of the city doesn't have any stormwater management. Weather events also seem to be more extreme. And you've probably heard the term rain bombs to refer to high intensity, short duration storms. Okay. And then, of course, more pavement, more days of sun, and we get hotter cities. So we actually are finding cities are getting hotter. We've got more pavement, it's heating up. And so we've got that urban heat island occurring. And this actually creates microclimates. So it actually rains more on cities and then just downwind of them. This has been demonstrated for decades. But cities are going to have more hot days in the future, which could mean even more flooding because of more evaporation. So another thing we need to consider is to what extent do our national, state, and local policies play a role. So FEMA policies definitely play a role. U.S. flood insurance rates have been rising to try to dissuade people from living in places that flood by capturing the cost of rebuilding, the actual cost of rebuilding. So, flood insurance rates went up several years ago, and some people did choose not to rebuild in flood-prone areas. But there's a new risk rating that came out this October 1st, and it does include cost reductions for 23% of existing policies. What they did was they looked at what is the actual cost to rebuild in different areas. So it will affect policies in 50 states plus the District of Columbia. Now, 1.2 million policies will have lower costs, FEMA estimates, but about 3.8 million policies will increase. If you want to know more about this, I provided a link to an article about that. But I often like to point out that you don't have to allow people to reside in the 100-year floodplain, the area that's at greatest risk. For example, where I'm speaking to you from today in Albemarle County, we do not allow people to build in the 100-year floodplain. We were hit very hard by Hurricane Camille in 1969, which resulted in loss of life and property. And we determined that we would not allow that to occur. So it's only if you adopt FEMA's rules for ingress and egress of floodwaters and elevating 1 foot above the base flood elevation, then you can build in the floodplains, but you don't actually have to allow that. And I think if you really are considering the future, you might want to reconsider where you allowed people to build. And then we're also going to be having a social equity concern in the future. Can everyone afford to pay for these new policies? Or can people afford to move or get out of harm's ways? So climate refugees is a new concern for the US. Some cities are buying out or relocating people who are living in dangerous flood zones. But even those areas that people kind of coped with occasional high water are becoming untenable in the future. So it's a big concern that we have to work on. So part of the solution, because I don't want to just make everyone depressed now, but we do have solutions. And one of them is to protect or expand our green infrastructure. If we do that work, we can preserve biodiversity and wildlife habitat, which is very near and dear to my heart, conserve working lands such as farms and forests that contribute to the economy, protect and preserve water quality and supply, so protecting those recharge zones or protecting your surface waters, providing cost-effective stormwater management and hazard mitigation. So those areas that are taking the brunt of storms, build up those natural buffers and let them be able to help buffer you against storms. And then improving public health, quality of life, and recreation networks. And we saw this especially during the pandemic, which is still going on, unfortunately. But we're seeing people really wanting to get outside, to recreate where they can be safe in the great outdoors. But we're also finding that a lot of our parks are getting overstressed because we don't have enough space for everyone. So as we think about flooding and what some of the solutions are, we decided we would develop a study to look at how urban trees could help us prevent or mitigate stormwater runoff. Trees, of course, give us lots of benefits like clean air, shade, and beauty, but they also give us stormwater benefits. So we wrote a proposal to the US Forest Service in partnership with 6 states, Alabama, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. And we looked at 12 cities, including a couple of counties. What we asked ourselves was, how can we make a city function like a forest, right? Because we have changed the hydrology of the landscape by paving over much of it. So can we bring in back some of that infiltration and functionality? So there's a lot of paved areas in cities, and it's hard to kind of get your head around what are the cumulative impacts of all those areas. So I tried to break it down. So 1 acre of pavement, just 1 acre, releases 36 times more runoff than a forest. Or another way of thinking about it, if it rains 1 inch, an acre of forest will release 750 gallons of water while absorbing the rest, while a parking lot will release 27,000 gallons. So if you add up all those vacant lots or even oversized parking lots in your cities or towns, and you multiply that, you start to see why you're having stormwater runoff problems. So what we wanted to show is how much stormwater the trees actually take up. And benefits in the past have been modeled on a tree by tree basis. So we said, how can we look at this at a landscape scale? And so there was a work group study for the Chesapeake Bay that looked at this question, and they used some work from Heineken Divers, and that what they had done was introduce a term called canopy interception to the runoff equation that most engineers use. And so they said, when the rain is falling, there's something between those raindrops and the ground, something big called a tree. And so we said, well, let's try to bring that in. Let's take that equation and let's actually apply it to the real world. So we actually create maps where we use satellite imagery to look at land cover. And so we have 1 meter by 1 meter data resolution looking at an entire city or entire town. And we can tell whether the trees are in a forest, whether they're overhanging a street, whether they're in a lawn. So we can look at that situation and figure out, using the soils, how much water could be soaked up by that tree in that location. So we create a little stormwater calculator, and I'm not going to get into great depth on this, but you can look at the current tree cover your community has, how impervious it is, how much water the trees are currently capturing, how much more water would run off with different tree loss, how much more water you could capture if you planted trees. And so you can look at it by event. So that's what engineers do, by storm event. You can look at a tree cover goal and see how much more water you can soak up if you met that goal. And then we also look at the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loadings that are coming off, and you can run scenarios with this calculator tool to see how much more pollution you could soak up or how much more pollution would occur if you lost your trees. And so this little calculator also has a second component, which is looking at the policies and practices that you might need. So are your policies making your city or town more impervious? Are you over paving the landscape? And do you have policies in place to create a healthy, expansive urban forest to help soak up that water? So we look at different things like whether your parking standards are out of whack. That's me, just kidding. That's not really very technical. We look at whether or not you have oversized spaces, whether you have too much parking required. You might want to consider a parking cap or maximum, variable space sizing. Do you use low impact development technology like bioswales in your parking lot? So we look at all of those different policies. Do you take care of your trees well? Do you have enough space for them? Do you use other technologies to help those trees expand and grow healthily? All right. And then lots of technologies exist today to help keep you from having these conflicts with utilities and conflicts with sidewalks. Do you have a forestry emergency response plan? So do you actually know what you're going to do if the storm comes through and knocks down a lot of trees? How are we going to clear the streets? Where are those trees going? Could those trees even be reused? There's a really cool project in Baltimore where they have a whole industry devoted to reclaimed wood, and they're selling all these beautiful live edge counters and tables, all from storm damaged trees. And so we give you a little spreadsheet, and you just check, is the policy there or not? Is it being adhered to? And you get points, which are weighted, because some policies matter more than others. And it gives you a little report card at the end, and it tells you, areas you might want to look at improving. And I've done this report card for different communities across Virginia, and sometimes I make that a homework assignment for my students. So maybe they could do an evaluation for you. So all of these products are online on our website if you want to learn more about using trees to soak up stormwater, if you want to use the tool to evaluate your own codes, and also case booklets for the 12 cities that we studied, as well as a report recommending what to focus on. But now I want to get into a little case study for the city of Norfolk. I've talked generally about some of the tools that are available, but let's actually get into what the city of Norfolk can do. So it's the second most threatened landscape in America. New Orleans is the first. And what's happening similarly in both communities is the ground is subsiding while the sea level is rising. That's a combination of water withdrawals from the aquifer that cause the land to sink, as well as starving that landscape of the normal sediment loads. So Green Infrastructure Center, the city of Norfolk, and Old Dominion University applied together for a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. It also included several $1 million for shoreline restoration. It was led by the Department of Public Works. Our role was to lead the steering committee as well as the community workshops and create the data to inform the plan. We had 10 community meetings for input and lots of field work. So the plan provides data, maps, and strategies that the city can use. And if you want to get a copy of this plan for yourself, it's online and available for free download. So getting to the idea of green infrastructure, here on the left, we have the gray infrastructure, and that's what urban planners often look at. And on the right-hand side, we have the green infrastructure, and that's the wetlands, the rivers, the bays, the tree canopy, all of that other side of the equation that's important for a healthful city. And the Green Infrastructure Plan was adopted, so it is actually now part of the city's comprehensive plan, which they call Plan Norfolk 2030. And it supports other plans that they have in place, such as resiliency. There were also one of the 100 resilient cities supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. So first step was to create new land cover to take the aerial imagery of the city and actually digitize that data so that we could understand what's marsh, what's impervious surface, what's turf, what's trees, what's shrubs, etc. So as we look at the city, the first step is to look at what are the assets that they have in place. So this is a map of all the city's tree canopy and then some of the larger chunks of intact forest in that sort of lime green. Then we can look at the water resources, and here we've added the wetlands and streams, but those little funny blue circles are also the various BMP projects like rain gardens and other structures they put in place to try to help them. So we wanted to get that all on a map. And then recreation, looking at, they have both land-based trails, bike routes, and they have a water trail. So uh, you can paddle around and see different sites. And then, of course, historic and cultural assets. So we looked at historic districts, but we also looked at forgotten histories such as African American history and other indigenous history that was not included. So we did a lot of interviews with community members to bring in that history that is not necessarily written down or on a map yet. And then we looked at risks and opportunities. So, looking at the city, this is, just a picture with the historic districts, structures, trees, etc. But looking at the future sea level rise for 2100, we see that there's going to be a major impact to the city. So there's no time like the present to start planning for this. And so we thought, well, what sea level rise should we be planning for? It's kind of hard, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work if you're involved in resiliency planning. As you talk about 100 years from now, a lot of people think, well, I'll be dead. There's nothing I can do about that. So you have to bring in a planning horizon that's a little more relatable. And the second part of that is if you're planning for projects, you want to think about what's, a reasonable time horizon. How long should this project last, before it might actually be overtaken or, everything falls apart at some point. So we thought we're doing natural infrastructure projects. So we want to have a lifespan of about at least 20 years. So we thought, well, let's look at sea level rise for the year 2040. And you'll see the projections of high, high, moderate, low, and historic. Well, we know it's not going to be historic or low. So the answer is somewhere between that highest and high number is where the sea level is going to be. So you can look at getting up to about 2 foot of sea level rise by the year 2040. And let me also note that every time the International Panel releases its numbers on sea level rise, they are consistently saying each time that the sea is rising faster. So the rate is accelerating each time. So it's happening faster than we think. So in my personal opinion, the high number is the more realistic number. But because there can be debate, we pick that sort of range between the two of high and highest. There's a lot of habitat restoration work that's been done on the ground by community members, but more is needed. So we looked at living shorelines across the whole city. So not just the few spots where the community had done them and the city, but across the entire city. And Norfolk is a water city, right? So it has lots and lots of shoreline. So we looked at places where you could restore it, where the marsh might be constrained and couldn't move inland as sea rose, places where the shoreline was hardened and could be created as natural, or it was hard, but it could not be naturalized. So remember, this grant had actually millions of dollars for restoration work too, not just planning. So this is sort of how we use the swath, so we actually took like a 2.5 foot to 1.5 foot swath. And so there's slightly different colors depending on what you believe is going to be the sea level rise. But this kind of gave us our area for planning and looking at impacts. And so we had a lot of shorelines like this one that's hard. And we said, could this be created as a soft shoreline to help, absorb storm surge and also provide habitat? So looking all across the city, this was quite an effort, but luckily we had some data from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science where they had already done a lot of shoreline analysis. And don't even try to digest this flow chart, but this is the flow chart they created, and it's sort of a visual depiction of how they modeled where shoreline restoration might be possible. But the takeaway is a lot of this has to do with how much energy is hitting that shoreline, how much fetch, which is a combination of wave energy and wind energy. So there are a few spots where, because of that incredible energy, we can't convert that hard shoreline to soft. So we looked at this across the city and then looked at where those opportunities were for every single watershed. So you can see, like in the Lafayette River, they had the greatest potential for shoreline restoration, followed by the eastern branch of the Elizabeth River, sort of the second highest there. So here's an example of an actual project that resulted from this. So this is that same hardened shoreline I showed you before. And in order to make room to create a marsh, we actually had to pull out into the open water a bit and build back up some of that soil. But now we've created a marsh habitat that supports, crustaceans and shellfish and fish, but it also is now providing a buffer against wave and wind energy. And this is immediately after planting. So this is going to thicken up quite a bit. This is just sort of year one. So we also looked where the marsh might actually be overtopping and migrating inland. So where would you have new marsh formation? And we're already seeing this with some residents who like cannot build an addition on their house because now their yard is classified as a wetland. So this is current implications for people, not just for the future. It's happening right now. So we looked at all these factors and we built a model for the city to understand where those marshes were moving to. And then we looked at where there were areas where the marsh could migrate inland with less impact or where it would have great impact. So here's an example where, showing in the bottom that, okay, the sea is going to rise from this first dash line to the next dash line and eventually may overtop it. But in some cases, we still have enough room in a yard for that marsh to overtop, and those people don't have to abandon that structure. We also looked at planting. Where could you actually plant in the future? So if we want to plant forested buffers that help with water quality and also buffering from storms, should we plant in this location if in 10 years that location is going to be underwater and our trees will drown because they're not wetland trees? So we can start to plant the uplands now so that in 20 years, they'll still be solid. They'll still be in existence. They'll still be resilient. So resiliency is not just about picking, say, the right species to plant, but where are you putting them, keeping in account for sea level rise. So that shows how we showed the city where they could plant and where that would make sense for the future. And you can even see some of these structures on the top left. They're actually, potentially going to be impacted. So then the other thing we want to look at is that flooding problem. So we had looked at the city's flooding complaints, and a lot of them were down along the water, right? So people are saying it's flooding in my yard, it's flooding on my street. But we know about sea level rise, but there's also, sources of water coming from the land. So what we looked at is where's the most impervious places in the city in the upland. And that's the source of a lot of that water flowing downstream and causing flooding in the neighborhoods. So we created sort of a set of steps: fit as many trees as possible, so soak up as much water with vegetation, then install best management practices, and then incentivize retrofit. So trying to actually redesign that urban landscape so that it can be more infiltrative. And one of the things we did was we did an analysis for all of the parcels in the city. So we took every single parcel and we looked at just how impervious it was. So sort of light green, and a lot of these sort of light green colors are probably marsh, on up to the most impervious areas where the imperviousness is 91 to 100% impervious. So we looked at every single parcel. And then we were lucky to have a study from Timmins where they had done a storm drain analysis for the city, and they looked at the capacity of the storm drains, whether they were basically at capacity because the sea had risen, for example, and they were sitting full even when it wasn't raining, maybe half full, so they still had some capacity left, or they were okay. And then where were there opportunities to expand those storm drains to hold more water, and where were they actually already full or full in the future and couldn't be expanded? So, not everywhere in the city could we make a bigger storm drain. So we have to look to the landscape, to the source of stormwater. So that's what I'm always doing when I'm working with engineering firms, is encouraging them to not start with oversizing the storm drain, but look at the land and try to reduce the amount of water that's going into the system in the first place. So this final map, and I have like 10 more slides on this particular topic, but I just wanted to be brief. So this map shows sort of the result. And so what we did was we analyzed all those parcels again and looked at the storm drain information, so above ground and underground information, and looked at where they wanted to focus on storage. Say they didn't have room in the storm drain and they didn't have place to put green infrastructure. So maybe cisterns, rooftop storage, that type of water storage underground parking lots, under parking lots. So we looked at that. We looked at areas where they could add green for infiltration. And so it's a parcel map for the entire city with strategies for stormwater for every parcel. So it's kind of a neat tool to use when you're, say, the head of stormwater planning for the city, and you've got to think strategically about where to deploy your resources. So an example, you could infiltrate on rooftops. So for example, could you put green rooftops? This is a green rooftop next to what's called the Slover Library. So if you ride to the 8th floor or 7th floor, whatever it is, you can look out and actually see this green rooftop. But look to the left, this is what the landscape looks like in that neighborhood. So you can see that we don't have a lot of room to add trees. Even though I've got a couple trees here, it's a pretty hardscape landscape. Trees, of course, are the original and best green infrastructure. So they provide a lot of benefits, but even just a single tree can take up anywhere from 760 to 4,000 gallons per tree per year. So we mapped the city's canopy as part of that analysis of land cover. They had 26% canopy. If they planted every single scrap of available land, they can only get to 36%. And interestingly, the city's goal was 40%. So we had to be the bearer of bad news and say that actually you guys can't plant your goal. You would actually have to raise buildings to plant that, which, you know, I don't know, maybe there's some buildings they could get rid of, but it's just not realistic. So we said, why don't you think about planting half of the land that we've evaluated as available for trees so that you could still have vegetable gardens, etc. So to do that, we said a realistic goal would be about 30% canopy goal. And then we calculate for them. A lot of cities set goals, but they don't do the math. So here's the math. We figured out the city had to plant 58,000 trees annually for the next 20 years to get to their new goal. And they're currently netting about 1,000 trees annually. So that means that tells the city that you have to start really accelerating the rate and number of trees that you're planting to meet your goal. So I like goals that can be achieved. So if the city wants to lower their goals, they could do that, or they could make the time horizon longer, 40 years. But the key is to really get active and starting to replace a lot of that canopy that's been lost. And then we wanted to help them understand, you know, that this has to be a citywide community-based campaign because like cities usually only own about 20% of the land. If you add up all of your land in parks and around the sewage treatment plant, et cetera, it's no more than 20% of the land. So you're not going to get to a tree canopy goal unless you work with private landowners. So we did a little analysis of the city's yards. We looked at 47,500 parcels in the city. 31,000 of those single family parcels could fit at least one tree. Now they could have fit 2 or 3, some of them, but like we said, let's just get one tree more in there. So if everyone planted a single tree, they could intercept another 62 million gallons of rainwater every year, or 1.5 million bathtubs. So we're trying to show the city that, you know, encourage citizens to do this because they can make a difference. So the city does a lot of tree giveaways. And they're very popular, and they take those tree giveaways around to different neighborhoods so that, you know, they're not just having it in the upper educated neighborhood, but they're going to low income neighborhoods, racially diverse neighborhoods, all different kinds of neighborhoods. So everyone has a chance to get a tree in their yard. And then helping them look at their streets themselves. Where can they take that public infrastructure? So as you know, cities can control their own streets in Virginia. So we said, well, you know, you've got some streets that are overly wide. I know streets have to handle traffic volume, but we've got streets in the city that are way over designed so that you can put that road on a diet and snake it down to one lane, but that would give you room for bioswales, bicyclists, pedestrians would actually want to walk there. And this is an area of the city that's redeveloping. So it makes sense to actually make complete green streets. So some of the examples of their goals, I'm not going to read these off to you because you can read the plan, but we kind of divided them up by land and water. And they include both natural infrastructure and constructed green infrastructure, open space for access for people to have a healthy lifestyle, protecting shorelines, and expanding water access. So this is their network of the future. And I just want to point out what you're seeing here. We made 2 maps, kind of green infrastructure as it exists, and then green infrastructure for the strategic plan. And these yellow lines are all of the different new connections that we want to make. So they're connections that don't exist now, but that help the community get from, say, school to work, or help them access a cultural resource. So the city is very disconnected. Some of that has to do with past planning and poor planning and some racism and redlining and all of those things you're hearing about today. So we're actually using the Green Infrastructure Project to not only network nature, but network people. And all these lines were drawn in with the residents and committee members and the city staff. So this is not my network, it's their network. So using the plan, they have new tools for bike lanes, new rec facilities, places they might want to put trails, and even relocate a few trails that will be impacted by sea level rise. Resiliency, making sure they have adequate open spaces, adequate buffers against storms, vibrant neighborhoods and commercial districts, and then partnerships. So the city already does a great job with partnerships. They have all different types of engagement with grassroots groups and the city agencies. They all come together every month for their watershed task force. That's something pretty unique. The city already had a standing committee made up of 8 of the different departments in the city, as well as community groups. And so they're always available to work on these things, and they're the ones that are also making sure that the plan continues to be implemented. So last few slides just showing you success to date. They've actually created 5 living shorelines and several new stormwater ponds and wetlands. They've got 10 additional projects under construction. And then there's a whole bunch of other smaller community-led shoreline projects. They've also increased their tree planting to meet the goal. They have 6 new legacy groves. They've actually planted some fruit orchards so they can have like edible green infrastructure. And then they have 3 annual tree adoption events, and then lots of other little rain gardens, cisterns, permeable pavement projects. So all across the city, they're using that map I showed you to find ways to infiltrate water. And then lots of cross programming. They're working with the arts community. So they even have some artistic green infrastructure structures. And then some of these projects might not be immediately visible to you, but what they're doing is this is newly planted on the right. This is a little bit more mature on the left. But they're taking a lot of those spaces that are just on city properties and adding that rain garden infiltration or habitat. They also adopted a new zoning ordinance, which you might be interested in, where it actually encourages new development in the neighborhoods that are high enough to be more resilient to sea level rise, and discourages building and growth in those neighborhoods that will be subject to future impacts. And then one of the things that also happened as a result of the project was the plan was modified a little bit so that they could actually reduce their points in the community rating system. That's the FEMA system that assigns points to your community, and that affects how much you pay for flood insurance. So they're actually able to drop another level, and that made their insurance rates go down. So if you want to be a hero to your community, reducing people's flood insurance is a great way to go about that. Oops. Okay, and then just showing some more of the projects that the city has done. And then there's a lot of resources for residents. So always engaging the community. They have already, one of the things that was created or upgraded rather for this project was a website, Retain Your Rain. Old Dominion University worked on that. It's got a lot more actions and projects citizens can do. And then you can become a river star if you're in the half of the city that drains the Elizabeth River. And you do all these things in your yard to infiltrate and you get a flag. People love flags. And then the city replicated that with something called Bay Star homes to account for the other half of the city that drains the Chesapeake Bay. And so you get a Bay Star flag. It's the same kind of idea, but the city runs that one. As we move forward, the question is, can we always accommodate sea level rise? Likely not. So some retreating will be necessary. So when we began the project, the city said, it sounds like Patton, we shall not retreat. But after the project went on for a couple of years, the city also changed their tune and said, yeah, in some cases we're going to need to retreat, but let's plan for it. How can we deal with social inequities? Who can afford to elevate their home? Who was devastated because they couldn't do that? So that idea of climate refugees and thinking of ways to accommodate those folks or to provide the financial help to help them move. And then how do we pay for restoration projects and shorelines move inland? Do we need to create even more projects upland? How do we pay for maintenance, right? So we're doing a lot of these projects. That was something the city really had to grapple with, is not installing too many projects that they can't maintain. And emergency services, how do they access neighborhoods that get cut off from water during high water events? This is happening now, so it's a current challenge. So a large cost is lurking, and this is true for all of our coastal communities. Today, I didn't really get into, the resiliency challenges of changing weather for fire, especially in the West. But every community in America just about is having some effects from climate change. So we're going to have to change the way that we plan and start looking a lot farther down the road. The good news is that the problem is being solved. Communities across the country, Norfolk's just one example, are actually creating adaptive and resilient plans for the future. And my next project I hope to be working on is in Hampton Roads, in the city of Hampton itself. So we have a grant currently pending with FEMA, so fingers crossed that that will come through next year. So that's it. I kept to my 45 minutes, and if there's questions, I think I see a hand or two up. So my question to you is, how can our tools help you achieve your goals? Or you're free to ask me questions about things I didn't cover today, because I can't solve all the world's problems in 45 minutes.
Thank you, Karen. I'll let Anna Marie ask her question, and then John, you're next.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. Excellent, excellent presentation, packed with great information, and I've learned a lot. I do have a couple brief questions, would love your insight on.
Sure.
As we're watching the decline of malls across America and them struggling, and there's so much, large parking space and pavement space, is there any insight you have around that? And then secondly, I have a question about the financial. You brought up the maintenance piece. To maintain an orchard, for example, to me, that seems to be, it would be more cost effective to maintain that with pruning and such than it is to maintain large paved space where you have to repave and keep and upkeep. That's very expensive. Can you provide some insight into both of those questions?
Sure. So I think there was really three questions there. The first one was about large malls. Yeah, I think that we actually, where I'm talking to you from, Albemarle County, have a mall that's in bankruptcy, and then most of the anchor stores have left. I would love to see that actual whole site be redesigned, to actually reconstruct the whole thing and put shopping below and living on top. And then we could use some of that additional space for parks and green spaces. If you look at places like the city of Paris, they've got parks on top of underground malls. Because if you think about it, when you go to shop at Macy's, there's no windows there anyway, so you might as well be underground with the park on top. In the Pearl District in Oregon, they've done a great job with having buildings that have stores below and people living above, so you can ride your elevator down below and get access to your groceries for the evening. So there's a lot of great opportunities to redesign, because I think people do not like the sort of malls of the past. So I got myself lost in the malls question. Can you re-ask the other question you had?
Yes, it was the cost between orchard
Okay.
versus large paved space and the financial impact of that.
You could look at it different ways. So if it's a privately owned large paved space, you might think, well, that's not costing the city anything. It's just sitting there as a vacant parcel, but it's bringing down the real estate values of the entire neighborhood. So there's a fiscal cost there. And then that site is probably causing a lot of runoff. The city's in charge of the storm drains. So they're paying for all of that additional infrastructure cost to treat that water that's coming from an untreated site. So it might make sense to acquire that space. So we worked with the city of Richmond, for example. We mapped all of their 9,000 vacant parcels and helped them figure out which parcels might make sense to acquire for future green space versus sites that should be sold for redevelopment. Because there's a strategic decision to be made, and a lot of cities haven't really effectively evaluated what vacant urban space they do have and what might be the most strategic use of it. So I've been involved in a lot of projects involving narrowing streets, replanting them, and opening up boarded up shops to create new vibrant shopping districts. It can be done, but I think the investment by the city in the infrastructure is a really important first step. And then you asked about orchards and sort of that pavement. So yes, orchards require some pruning. They require some upkeep. But if you had and probably a little bit more than, say, a park that just had some regular canopy trees in it. But part of the reason Norfolk invested in these orchards, think of it like a gateway drug. They wanted to get people excited about trees, and they thought, well, we need to get some new stakeholders. So they actually created this thing called Jam and Jams that they copied from Texas. And you basically go and learn how to make pie and jam. So people like pie and jam. And then they say, by the way, did you know that if you had a fruit tree in your yard, you could make jam all the time? So that those orchards that they're building with the communities are getting people excited about fruit trees as a gateway to canopy trees and other types of trees. So that's kind of what the was to get those foodies into the tree movement.
Wonderful.
And there's actually a community guide on how to create community-based orchards. If anyone's interested, shoot me an email and I'll send you the citation for that. It was written by a community advocate who learned all the hard lessons and now knows how to do it.
All right, John.
Hey, how you doing? I appreciated the question that Anna Marie asked. Sort of the financial aspect was kind of where I was going as well.
Sure.
There wasn't just something along the lines of fruit trees, just overall. Do you guys ever consider and try and sell the sustainable and reduced cost of maintaining green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure?
Sure. Absolutely.
And also, you mentioned one of the things we've seen over especially like the 90s and the 2000s isn't necessarily urban where we think of green infrastructure, but that suburban sprawl that's been happening as more and more of those natural forests and trees and wetlands are paved over. How do we incentivize counties, cities, localities who are looking for that property tax? How do we sell it to them that encouraging green infrastructure will actually be more cost effective for them in the long run if they make requirements for those new building permits for the developers and things like that?
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there, but to let you know, EPA has a really useful guide where they compare the cost of traditional infrastructure like stormwater ponds against green infrastructure like bioswales. So they've actually got the cost breakdown showing hundreds of thousands of dollars saved. And also one of the ways that you really save money is in the long-term maintenance. It's actually both rain gardens and stormwater ponds need to be maintained, but it's a lot more expensive to get a backhoe out there and dredge out that stormwater pond and then try to figure out where to transport the spoils to, and the piping that goes to serve that pond, both the piping you put in initially, as well as the piping that you may have to replace in the future. So there's a lot of great data out there, both on the initial construction costs and long-term maintenance. But one sometimes overlooked benefit is the fact that if you have a stormwater pond, unfortunately, most of them are designed ugly. There are beautiful designs you could consider, but most of them are ugly. They actually, depress property values rather than increase them. And so if you're adding beautiful gardens to your community, you're going to see that as an increase in property values. There's also a lot of data out there about, say, for example, if you add trees to downtowns, people shop longer and pay about 12% more per item in tree-lined shopping districts. There are lots of instances where constructed wetlands have been put in instead of stormwater ponds, either for stormwater. There's also constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment. There's a fun example out in Tucson where they decided that the most cost-effective thing would be to do a constructed wetland to treat the city's wastewater. It's now a major birding destination. People go to the wastewater wetland to watch birds, and birders spend more than any other type of tourist. So if you want that EPA guide, et cetera, again, just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to share that with you.
Yeah, I definitely will. Do you see more and more counties going towards that green infrastructure as we continue our suburban sprawl?
Yes, I'm working right now on a project for James City County. They're one of the counties that we've been studying for our resiliency project, but they decided to create their own green infrastructure plan. So we're working with them on the wildlife corridors and protecting the large important landscapes, and then also helping them think about how to grow and develop in more sustainable patterns. So we've just launched that project in the past few weeks. And always the environmental benefits are important. So for example, if you have a large natural area, that actually increases your property values more than skate parks or golf courses or any of those sort of more developed infrastructures that cost you money to maintain. So in my book, I have a lot of those citations. I have lots and lots of little facts that you can use to make your case by economics, by community health, by stormwater. So they're all set up as little bumper stickers because we all know that our city councils don't and county boards don't want to listen to a long story like today. Yeah, and Nicole just said she's enjoyed the birding area in Tucson. Yep.
And Amanda had asked a question in the chat about, do you feel that your status as a nonprofit impacts your ability to navigate the political sphere and make an impact in policy decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as a not-for-profit, we don't have any skin in the game. We are just providing objective scientific information, and it's up to the community to decide what they want to do. But in all the communities that we work in, we're always invited to come in. So we are not an advocacy group in the sense that I do not go and testify to boards uninvited. I come when I'm invited and provide helpful perspectives. But I just spent yesterday all day at the Department of Environmental Quality talking about how we can add trees as a recognized best management practice to the state's database. So I think because we're a nonprofit, our advice is sought and we're considered to be more neutral than, say, if I was, even the University of Virginia, where I also teach, can sometimes be considered to have an opinion. So yeah, that does help. Okay, and thanks for people who said thanks and need to go soon. It is 1 o'clock, so
Yes,
I can stay another minute if you need.
I think Jerry did want to just put a plug in for askhrgreen.org, which is a regional environmental public education program under the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. I think Celeste did have a quick question. Celeste, if you want to just ask it yourself. And I understand if people need to leave. I appreciate you coming today, so thank you.
Sure. Yes. So Karen, thank you so much for coming. And I have her book right here and I've used it in my class. And I just think you're a rock star. I love what you're doing. And I just wanted to ask you, I know you've done so much with Norfolk and it's amazing. But here in Virginia Beach, they have a bond referendum on the ballot in November. You're probably familiar with it, but I just wanted to get you, it's called the Ripple Effect, or it's the Virginia Beach's Flood Protection Program. It's a $560 million referendum. They said 40 million is allocated for green infrastructure. I couldn't get too many details on it when I was going to one of the webinars with the deputy city manager. And I just wanted to see, have you had any chance to review that plan or to look at what their strategy is and what your thoughts are on that?
I haven't personally reviewed that plan. Our GIS analyst lives in Virginia Beach, and so he attended some of the community meetings on that. Which he said, unfortunately, were very lowly, not well attended. For some reason, I think the way that they went about it, because they didn't have an existing committee like Norfolk does, it just, kind of said, come out, hear about the plan. And they didn't get a lot of attendance. But Virginia Beach itself has done a tremendous job of protecting its natural infrastructure. I have used their comprehensive plan as long as 20 years ago to say, here's a model plan for other Virginia localities to follow in terms of recognizing the importance of their natural infrastructure. So I consider them a leader in the state. I don't know exactly what they plan to do with their $40 million, but I have a lot of faith in those guys. Like I said, their staff has attended all of the workshops that I put on. So they're a lot of fun because you give them an idea and they run with it.